Salve friends, welcome to episode number 7 of our Rome to Total War Divide Et Impera series. A lot happened in this rendition. We have battles, diplomacy and intrigue at every turn, quite literally. We started off by immediately asking the council their opinions on our ongoing wars. Was it wise to be fighting on 3 separate fronts? They decided we were on the front foot and we would lose our advantage should we pause for peace. However, on this note, we were also stretched very thin. Our armies were engaged on all fronts, and what governors we had were constantly being called into active frontline duty. To be frank, we had a number of large battles to fight and didn't have the economy currently needed behind us to create the armies necessary. Through expert diplomacy, peace was declared with Saka and Parthava at the demand that they pay war reparations. We were hoping that the wars of our satrapies in the east would be put on hold until we could better focus on that front. Pergamon's sudden and truce-breaking declaration of war was all anyone was talking about. We had to strike back, and soon. As we were shouting on about being the initial aggressor in the war in the north, Pergamon attacked our core province Iconion. Their heir was in command, and was a very experienced general. We had nothing defending other than some local militia that had been handed weapons and told to defend their home. Our traps were set, and we dug in for the siege to come. The enemy fielded one of the most impressive armies we had fought against, consisting more or less entirely of professional soldiers, with over half being hoplites and swordsmen. If Iconion should fall, the enemy would be made to pay dearly. With no cavalry whatsoever and the lack of any real flanking units, it was decided we would attempt to simply hold the square and put up a fight for as long as possible. The enemy clearly didn't think much of our defensive forces, as they sent their heavy lancers straight into our front lines. They did do a lot of initial damage, but our swirling mobs surrounded them and started pulling the riders from their horses, while fire arrows rained in from above. Every piece of damage we could inflict now would only weaken them down the road. While we started well, it did not take long for the enemy to begin overwhelming us. In any phalanx versus phalanx battle, the more experienced and better equipped side is going to get the better, and in this instance, that was not us. Our archers would continue to rain in fire from behind our own lines, but our time was beginning to run out. In a desperate attempt to cause a morale shock, some of our hoplites attempted to flank the enemy and attack them in the rear, perhaps feigning reinforcements arriving. This did not quite have the desired effect, however the enemy general did countercharge this flank and was brought down in the melee. If we were going to lose the town, our defenders had performed admirably, and had managed to kill the enemies next in line for the throne. In the aftermath, the city was looted and sacked. The enemy did not, however, move in and occupy, which was their biggest mistake. We had an army that was recruiting in the vicinity, and they were dispatched to organise a second defence should the enemy come calling, and that's exactly what happened. This time, however, we had an experienced general in command, as well as professional soldiers, and most importantly ballista. The second siege of Iconion in a matter of weeks was underway. We deployed our traps, and placed the key component of our plan, our ballista, on top of the hill next to the temple to rain in fire on the enemy as they blobbed up against our front line. Our engineers, however, had different ideas. They decided that the enemy, on their approach, should feel the wrath of our range. Flaming pots were fired and dealt significant damage to the enemy's tightly packed phalanxes as they marched towards the town. As our engineers manned the ballista and continued to rain in the fiery pots of doom, the remnants of our local militia organised themselves into a front line. Our commander had decided that they would absorb the initial charge, with our Seleucian levies then flanking and engaging the enemy from multiple sides. Our levies threw their first javelin volley to devastating effect, followed quickly by their second volley. These warriors from Anatolia had become one of our core units of our armies. They had served as far away as Egyptus, a long way from home. But here, they were fighting their neighbours and countrymen. With their chaotic charge, the enemy morale began wavering. Our ragtag thrown together defence starting to show signs of victory, and before long, the conga line of shame began forming, and the enemy clamoured towards Ankara. Our general's bodyguard unit was our only cavalry, and they attempted to run down as many enemies as possible, while our ballista did not stop firing. Iconion, despite being sacked, still remained in our hands, and we now found ourselves in a strong position to counterattack. However, there was no time to make plans in the north. Our joint siege on the Medeway coast found itself being threatened. Our fleet, which was greatly outnumbered, was attacked by the entirety of the enemy's naval forces. Our admiral, realising he was outnumbered, deployed our fleet in 2 lines. A strong frontal force, and some flanking units to sweep around and ram the enemy's ships, and the flanks and rears where they were weakest. Like all naval battles of this time period, initial rams and how successful they are would likely decide the outcome. Luckily, we had reinforced hulls on our ships, so we could absorb more damage than our African counterparts. Our flanking forces also worked a treat. As the enemy were bogged down and stuck in the floating mass of wood and rope, our flank ships began hard rowing towards the enemy's flanks, isolating and ramming any ships that were vulnerable. Before long, we had sunk the majority of the enemy's fleet, and any remaining ships and crew rowed for their lives. The siege was still on. With Pergamon now on the back foot in the north, our king, Antiochus I, and his heir, Antiochus II Soter, were deployed together to strike back at Pergamon's soft underbelly. The king had raised an elite army at our capital of Antioch, consisting of some of our new elite peltas units, while our heir had marched a small contingent north from Seleucia. Their armies had met outside the walls of Samosata, where the now 71-year-old king would show his heir and adopted son how it was done. The enemy decided to sally out of the town and fight us in the field, a bold choice on their part. So we marched confidently from the high ground down towards the desert-like plains and saw the enemy appear slowly from the smoke and sand in the distance. As the initial engagements played out, nothing was out of the ordinary. Our front line slowly dredged towards the enemy while skirmishers began firing overhead. All the while, our cavalry patrolled the flanks and our peltas and levy units stayed deep at the flanks, looking for any opportunity to manoeuvre. With the lines clashed and fully committed, our combined Sarissa lancers and companion cavalry began probing their rear. The entirety of their skirmishers left exposed, and our cavalry ran them down. Once the skirmishers had been routed from the field, it was merely a case of hitting and running the enemy's rear, while our new peltas and pike units kept them pinned. Our king and his heir made their intentions clear. The enemy would be slaughtered to a man, showing clearly what would happen if anyone tried to resist our advance through Pergamon's recently acquired territory. Our casualties from the engagement were in fact so light that plans were immediately made that at the season's end we would press on towards the next town. Once again though, the action continued. Our combined assault upon Ptolemy-Theron began. We had already destroyed their navy, the settlement was next. We deployed our forces close to the coastline and approached the town, using the shore to protect our flank. From the beginning, it was clear they would rather fight us in the open terrain than in the streets, so we charged towards the town looking to cut down the space available to them. With the lines beginning to clash, our navy approached the coastline and began disembarking. They would be used to probe the enemy's right flank while we continued encircling the left. Then our limited cavalry contingent, accompanied by our elephants, was sent through the town to attack the enemy in the rear. The whole engagement was more or less perfectly orchestrated, and every single unit did its job. A special mention has to be made of one of our thorough swordsman units that charged into the enemy's units that were attempting to pour from the streets and took heavy casualties while buying the rest of the army time to manoeuvre into place. With the victory here complete, we had a foothold in the heart of Ethiopia. This defeat left their capital wide open. After drawing conclusion from the battle, it was realised that most of Madawi's real resistance had been routed out during their attempted counterattack on Aegyptus. We had two armies now moving into Aegyptus, and were making preparations for our next incursion. However, a surprise attack came in the form of a siege at Ptolemy-Theron. Our army was still replenishing and rearming, but we were quietly confident that the remnants of resistance would be stepped out quite easily. We deployed in depth and used our traps on the approaches to the town square where we concentrated our defence. To our surprise, the enemy charged their armoured elephants straight at our defensive cavalry traps, and the spikes coupled with our skirmish fire brought that threat to an end very hastily. The massive corpses of the elephants then blocked the street and slowed the enemy's progress as they attempted to enter the town, meaning that our skirmishers had more time to rain fire and ignite our traps. The enemy's commander did show some initiative and attacked us on two fronts. However, our hoplites had prepared for this instance and readied themselves for the attack to come, while our Cilician levies flanked the enemy. Our cavalry began running down the enemy skirmishers that were exposed, while the rest of our cavalry contingent prepared to rear charge the enemy's units trapped in the street. Our Cilician levies then emerged like a wave from the side street and began attacking the enemy's flanking force in the rear, while our cavalry mirrored the manoeuvre on the main approach. It didn't take long for this hastily assembled army's morale to begin faltering. On the main approach, in a moment of sheer dominance, our commander, a beautiful, charismatic and charming bald man, climbed above the enemy and taunted them from above, while laughing continuously at their feeble attempts to win. With our victory now unchallenged on the coast, full attention turned towards the city of Mon-Wed-Fri itself. It did have large defensive walls and was well located in the desert. Capturing this jewel in their crown would be no easy feat. In the north, the brutality we showed towards Pergamon had the desired effect. The city of Armosata, hearing of our previous acts, rolled over to us with minimal resistance. We hoped this was an event that would continue as we tore Pergamon apart, and it did, as Coron bent the knee also, with once again minimal resistance. We had now carved a sizable section out of Pergamon's underbelly, crippling them. However, we had also split our single front line into two. We were also made aware that Pergamon's largest and most experienced armies were posted in the east, where they had been conquering their new territories. We braced for their approach. As Antiochus I handed command of the Nicator Guard over to his heir and adopted son, Antiochus II Soter, he reflected on his dynasty and political situation. He had hand-chosen his heir from his distant relatives, and realised how balanced his court was, as the many prominent families featured in high-ranking roles throughout our kingdom, from governors to statesmen to generals. However, the time for reflection was not now. Pergamon launched a surprise naval assault on the site of our famous northern incursion, Pontus, or Trapezius as it was actually known. They outnumbered our defenders and commanded more professional troops. This was going to be an uphill battle, as we lacked any real command structure and professional contingent to our defensive force. Our two coastal patrol vessels volunteered to charge their small ships at the enemy admiral's command section, bravely ramming the hulking ship time and time again while under severe projectile barrage until it finally sunk, managing to take two more smaller enemy vessels with them before they sadly succumbed to the sea. This brave sacrifice set the tone early and showed the Pergamon forces what we were willing to do to win. As the enemy's ships sank to the bottom of the sea, the rest of their forces sailed through the wrecks and towards the coastline, landing en masse. Our plan was to allow them to land and enter the town before counter-attacking and attempting to cut off their retreat, thus locking them in the town and forcing the primarily archer force into melee combat. With numbers almost even, it would be a slog, and if anyone did win, it would likely be a Pyrrhic victory at best. Our hoplite units attempted to use any of the surrounding buildings for cover from the intense barrage the enemy fired at us, and what little archers we had attempted to return fire. Our units had to withstand the bombardment until we could encircle their forces at the back. Then, our trap was sprung, and we began wildly charging at the enemy's forces as they began panicking and attempting to flee, only to realise their escape had been cut off. A desperate melee broke out and both sides accepted their fate. No one was going to be a clear winner here, and it came down to the discipline of our troops, as warriors from both sides attempted to flee. Our local militia hoplites had the volume of the work placed upon them. And through a stroke of sheer luck, one of our units that had begun to flee, the local plebs, returned to the battle from an advantageous route and rear-charged the enemy, sparking a mass retreat. And just like that, we had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. The great city of Mon-Wed-Fri, hearing of some of our acts in the north in recent years, decided to bend the knee to us, allowing our army access to the city with the local garrison providing little to no resistance. With this stroke of our sword, we had taken the jewel in the enemy's crown and left them with only a small settlement towards the coast to their name. Our two armies here would be combined and the remnants dispatched towards the final settlement. We then had the opportunity to brace our defences and look east for these rumoured Pergamon armies, or venture north and complete our conquest of the province of Trapezius. The council overwhelmingly voted to conquest north, and so the Nicator Guard, now under the command of our heir, took to the field. We immediately deployed and pushed towards the town, using our large pike wall as a front line and manoeuvring our peltas units around the flanks. One of the major issues we had encountered with Pergamon was the similarity between our army's compositions. We both deployed large volumes of pikes and hoplites, and battles tended to be drawn out and were normally decided by engagements out with the front line. Our peltas accepted this task and managed to completely kill an enemy unit without even engaging it in melee. This left their flank now wide open, and we began slowly cutting off the enemy's retreat until they had no choice but to face us in melee. Their decision was now clear: fight to the death or attempt to flee for their lives. The majority seemed to attempt to flee. And with this, we had cut a straight line through Pergamon, dividing the kingdom in two. A bold manoeuvre, as this now meant we were fighting on two fronts, east and west. The enemy's forces in the east finding themselves cut off from their capital. It was at this point the rumoured armies were spotted in the valley to our east. These were the enemy's veterans of their recent conquests in the mountains, and were now returning to their homes to see them in enemy hands. A large battle was brewing in the east. Our faction heir is now trapped in the recently conquered town and has little to no reinforcements, and is facing an army over twice his size. And this is where we will resume next time, with a pivotal battle to defend our recent conquest at the choke point of Coron. Throughout this episode we were on the offensive, and I feel that now shows as we command the greatest amount of land and settlements since we started. We have managed to effectively split Pergamon in two, and are currently sieging their capital of Ankara while they are threatening our east. Antiochus II must stand his ground and prove he has what it takes. The Medewi have been backed into a corner, and it is only a matter of time before they are vanquished from this world. But thank you to everyone for either tuning in live or watching the recap on the YouTubes. This was quite the episode, and has easily seen the most action out of any of them so far, with more on the horizon from the get-go next time. We will be resuming the campaign on Monday the 12th of July at 2000 BST. I hope to see you there, and as always, stay beautiful, and I will catch you on the next one.